Only my sister's child belongs in this family. My mother threw my luggage out and coldly said. My sister smirked. A single mother? How shameful. You have no place here. I held back tears, grabbed my son's hand, and walked away. Years later, I was on the TV screen. As my name was broadcasted everywhere, the phone wouldn't stop ringing. It was my mother and sister. Melissa Watson squinted at the sunlight streaming through the window as she folded the letter. At 32, she was a woman who had grown up in a small eastern town. With her long brown hair and gentle eyes, Melissa had always been told by those around her that she was too kind. This personality trait had sometimes been a strength in her life, and sometimes a weakness. Mom, what do you think of this? Jacob, clutching crayons on the living room floor, showed her the picture he was drawing. At 5 years old, he was everything to Melissa. With his light brown hair, intelligent eyes, and a maturity beyond his years, Jacob had inherited his mother's strong sensitivity. It's lovely, Jake. Melissa smiled and gently stroked her son's head. The dinosaur looks so real. Jacob nodded with satisfaction and returned to concentrating on his drawing. Melissa sighed and turned her gaze to the window. They were now at a major crossroads in their lives. The Watson family in which Melissa grew up was known in town as an exemplary household. Her father Robert served as president of the community college, and her mother Carol was a devoted housewife active in the local church. They had strictly instilled in their children the right way to live. A woman's happiness comes from being a good wife and a good mother. Carol's words still echoed in Melissa's ears. Even now in her 60s, Carol was a woman who stood straight-backed and always maintained a perfect appearance. Her worldview was straightforward. A family had to have the right form. Melissa's sister Amy, for years her senior, had followed the life path her mother expected. After graduating from a prestigious university, she married Richard, a successful lawyer, and now lived in a large suburban house with 2 perfect children. Amy always flaunted her victories to those around her and made no attempt to hide her sense of superiority, especially toward her sister. Melissa, if you just tried a little harder, you could meet a good man. Amy would shrug at every family gathering. There was always a cold light in her eyes. Melissa had majored in literature in college and dreamed of becoming a writer. However, reality was harsh. After graduation, she began working as a proofreader at a local publishing house. There she met Daniel Foster, who was teaching as a visiting professor at the university. Daniel was an intelligent and charming man. He asked Melissa to proofread his novel scheduled for publication, and the two gradually became close. Melissa was drawn to Daniel's deep insight and kindness, and he in turn loved Melissa's sensitivity and sincerity. However, Daniel had a secret. He had a wife and teenage daughter in another town. Melissa discovered this fact on the day she told him about her pregnancy. I love you, but I can't abandon my family, he said before leaving town. His last communication was just a check sent for childbirth expenses. Melissa decided never to use that check and to raise her son alone. For 5 years since Jacob was born, Melissa had struggled on her own. While working as a proofreader, she continued writing her own novel at night. However, making a living as a single mother was tougher than she had imagined, and finally she made a decision. She would return to her parents' home, at least temporarily, and seek her family's help. Her father Robert had passed away from a heart attack 2 years earlier. Melissa hoped that without her father, her mother might have become a little more flexible. But that was not the case. Melissa, to think you'd end up in this situation. At the doorstep, Carol's eyes appraised her daughter and grandson from head to toe. There was no warmth in them, only criticism and disappointment. Please, Mom, just for a little while, until I find a job and secure a place for us. Melissa swallowed her pride and pleaded. Carol let out a long sigh before reluctantly letting them into the house. But it was far from a welcome. Amy's reaction was the coldest. When she visited her mother's house with her children on the weekend, she wrinkled her nose as soon as she saw Melissa. I didn't think you'd actually come back, she said. And with him, she pointed at Jacob. Amy's children gave their cousin curious yet wary glances. They seemed unsure how to interact with the new family member, taking cues from their mother's attitude. Jacob is very smart and kind. Melissa put a protective arm around her son. I think he'll get along well with your children. Amy laughed coldly. Yes, of course, but Joshua and Emma have been raised in a proper home environment, so we'll have to be careful about certain influences. Those words were as sharp as a blade, cutting into Melissa's heart. She wanted to object, but feeling Carol's stern gaze, she fell silent. She had to endure for her son's sake. They wouldn't be able to stay in this house for long. Still, they needed time and a place for a fresh start. Melissa looked at Jacob's drawing again. There, besides the dinosaur, was a small family, a mother and child. She took a deep breath and told herself she needed to be strong. No matter how difficult, she had to overcome this situation for her son's sake. Even if only cold stares and criticism awaited them in this house, She needed the courage to move forward. "It's okay, Jake," Melissa whispered softly. "We'll find our own place someday." But her inner heart was filled with anxiety. The trials awaiting them in this house would likely be harsher than she could imagine. Melissa placed her bags in the small guest room and sat on the bed. A week had passed since returning to her mother's house. In the family photos on the wall, there were no images of her and Jacob. It suggested that her existence had been deliberately erased from the family memory. "Jake, please arrange your shoes," Melissa gently called to her son. "Grandma loves tidiness." Jacob nodded obediently and neatly arranged his small shoes beside the door. He already seemed to sense the tension in this house. Every morning, Carol prepared breakfast at precisely the same time. At the table, her questions were always the same. "Where are you going to look for work today?" Melissa had been taking her resume around town to publishing houses and bookstores. However, in this small town, jobs matching her skills were hard to find. "I'm planning to go to Harper's Bookstore and the Chronicle newspaper today," Melissa answered. Carol frowned. "Shouldn't you consider more realistic options? You could get hired as a supermarket cashier right away." "Mom, I have experience in proofreading and editing. I'm just looking for work where I can use those skills." "You're not in a position to be picky. Given your situation," Carol placed a dish down firmly. "If you plan to stay in this house indefinitely, you'll need to show more effort." Melissa took a deep breath. Suppressing her desire to argue, she simply nodded. "I understand. I'll stop by the supermarket on my way back." Jacob was eating his breakfast quietly. He was sensitive to his mother's mood and tried not to cause her any additional burden. That pained Melissa's heart even more. Carol picked up her teacup and declared, "I agree to let you come here as a temporary measure. I'm retired now and want to live peacefully." "I know, Mom," Melissa answered. "We intend to become independent as soon as possible." On weekends, Amy would visit her mother's house with her family. She drove around in a flashy SUV and carried expensive designer bags. Richard, as a successful lawyer, provided his family with a luxurious lifestyle. "Melissa, you're still here?" Amy said as if surprised. "Well, have you found a job?" When everyone gathered in the living room, Amy began talking endlessly about her own life, her children's excellent grades, Richard's recent big case, the new vacation home they had purchased. Joshua won first place in the piano competition. Emma was assigned a solo in the ballet recital, she boasted proudly. To nurture a child's talent, stable support from both parents is essential, don't you think? Those words were clearly meant to sting Melissa. Carol nodded with satisfaction, enthusiastically affirming Amy's words. "Melissa, does your child do any activities?" Amy suddenly asked. Jacob was quietly reading a book in the corner of the living room. He was a smart child with a vivid imagination. However, due to financial constraints, Melissa couldn't afford expensive activities for him. "Jake loves reading. He might be a future writer," Melissa answered proudly. Amy snorted. "Oh, I see. Just like you. But shouldn't you consider a more practical profession? Succeeding as a writer is like winning the lottery." While passing around tea and snacks, Carol said, "Amy's right. Find a stable job. This is no time to chase dreams." Melissa just smiled and didn't argue. She had to endure for her son's sake. At dinner, Amy suddenly asked, "By the way, how's Jacob's dad doing? Is he paying child support properly?" Tension ran through the table. Melissa put down her fork and quietly said, "Could you please stop that? Jake can hear you." "Oh, I'm sorry," Amy offered a false apology. "But I think a father's presence is important for children. Look at our kids. They're growing up so healthy because Richard is such a wonderful father." Melissa bit her lip. Enduring the hurtful words, she answered, "I intend to fulfill both mother and father roles for Jake." "That's not enough," Carol interjected. "Children need a complete family environment. Without a man's guidance, especially boys tend to develop problems." Melissa focused on her food, swallowing her retort. In her line of sight was Jacob's small face. He was pretending not to understand the adults' conversation, but there was sadness in his eyes. Joshua's 8th birthday party was approaching. Amy was planning a grand party at her mother's house and demanded everyone's participation. "Of course, Jacob can come too." Amy showed false generosity. "But make sure to bring a proper present. My children are used to brand-name items." Melissa bought Joshua a science book with her meager savings. It wasn't expensive, but it was a heartfelt gift from her. On the day of the party, Amy's house was decorated lavishly. A professional clown, a bounce house, upscale catering, everything was perfectly prepared. Jacob was quiet, watching the other children from the corner. He seemed to want to join in, but Joshua and his friends were ignoring him. "Mom, why won't anyone play with me?" Jacob asked in a small voice. Melissa felt her heart constrict. "It's okay, Jake. They're just excited. Why don't you go over and talk to them?" Jacob summoned the courage to try joining his cousin's games. But as he approached, Joshua frowned. "This is our game. You can't join." Joshua said coldly. But I want to play too, Jacob said softly. Joshua turned to his friends and said loudly, he doesn't have a dad. Isn't that weird? As the children started laughing, tears welled up in Jacob's eyes. He suddenly bumped his hand against a glass of juice on the table, spilling it on Joshua's new shirt. Look, he did it on purpose. Joshua shouted. Amy rushed over angrily. What have you done? This shirt was expensive. I'm sorry, Aunt. It wasn't on purpose, Jacob said in a trembling voice. I don't want excuses. Amy grabbed his arm. We shouldn't have invited a child like this to the party. You have no discipline. Melissa hurried to defend her son. Amy, calm down. It was just an accident. He's a child. An accident? Your child did it deliberately. Amy raised her voice. Look, everyone's watching. A problem child ruins the party. Carol came over and saw the situation. Oh my, what a mess. Mom, look, this is the result of single mother parenting, Amy said sarcastically. A parent who can't discipline properly can only raise a child like this. The parents gathered in the living room began to whisper. That boy doesn't have a father? Poor thing. No wonder he acts out. Melissa hugged her son. It's okay, Jake. Let's go home. Wait, Carol said. You've ruined the party, so you need to apologize properly. Melissa took a deep breath. Jake has already apologized. It was an accident. Amy should stop humiliating a child. Upon returning from the party, Carol's anger reached its peak. As soon as she opened the front door, she began yelling at Melissa. Your child has embarrassed the entire family. Carol's face was red with anger. Amy's reputation that she built over years is ruined. Mom, please calm down, Melissa said. Don't blow a child's accident out of proportion. Out of proportion? Carol laughed. You've always run from responsibility. You became a single mother because you couldn't choose a man properly, didn't you, Mom? Melissa raised her voice. Don't talk like that in front of Jake. But Carol wouldn't stop. That boy will become a problem child, growing up in a home without a father. I can't raise such a child in my house. Mom, please. Melissa's voice was trembling. At that moment, Amy appeared at the entrance. There was a triumphant light in her eyes. Melissa, you don't belong here, Amy said coldly. Being a single mother is shameful. You're a bad influence on my children. Carol suddenly went upstairs toward Melissa's room. She opened the drawers, grabbed clothes, and began throwing them downstairs. Mom, what are you doing? Melissa cried in surprise. Get out, right now, Carol said coldly. You've done enough to ruin my family. Only your sister's child belongs in this family. Carol threw Melissa's suitcase at the entrance. You and your child are not welcome in this house. Melissa stood stunned. Can you really do this? To your own daughter and grandson? Amy folded her arms and smiled with satisfaction. Being a single mother is a disgrace. You have no place here. Jacob was clinging to his mother's legs, crying. Mom, what's happening? Why are our things? Melissa held back her tears. She took her son's small hand and said, It's okay, Jake. We're going on a new adventure together. She hurriedly gathered the scattered clothes and stuffed them into the suitcase. Carol and Amy just watched with cold stares, not offering to help. Don't ever come back, Carol said finally. With unsteady legs, Melissa walked out the door. To maintain her dignity, she straightened her back and firmly held her son's hand. Jacob's small hand gave her courage. Where are we going? Jacob asked anxiously. Melissa smiled at her son. We're going to find our new home. A peaceful place just for the two of us. She didn't look back, but she could feel Amy watching with a triumphant expression from the house window. Melissa held back her tears and continued walking, gripping her son's hand tightly, telling herself that this wasn't the end but a new beginning. Melissa sat on the bed in a small motel room, gently stroking her son's hair. It was the third night since they had been thrown out of her mother's house. All they had were the clothes hastily packed and meager savings. Still, Melissa felt a strange sense of liberation in her heart. You're starting a new school tomorrow, Melissa said to Jacob. Are you nervous? Jacob nodded slightly. Yes, but I'll be fine, because you're with me. His unconditional trust warmed Melissa's heart. She hugged her son and promised, We'll manage just fine. The next day, Melissa rented a cheap apartment on the other side of town. The small one-room dwelling on the ground floor only had a view of the neighboring building's wall, but it was enough for them. This is our castle. Melissa smiled at Jacob as she unlocked the door. What do you think? Isn't it lovely? Jacob's eyes lit up as he ran around the room. Where's my room? This is an open space, so we'll divide it with curtains, Melissa answered. It will be our special place. That afternoon, Melissa found a job at a local bookstore. The pay wasn't high, but it was a place where she could use her experience. The shift from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. works fine, said Martha, the store owner. You can match your child's school hours. Melissa was filled with gratitude. Thank you. I'll do my best. However, The bookstore salary alone made life difficult. Melissa also started working as a waitress at a local diner from evening to night. Jacob would do his homework in a booth at the back of the diner while waiting for his mother to finish work. "When it's not busy, you can eat with us," said Lucy, the diner's owner. As a single mother herself, she understood Melissa's situation. At night, after Jacob had fallen asleep, Melissa would sit at the small kitchen table and open her laptop. She had begun writing about her experiences. At first, it was like a diary, but gradually it took shape. Living as a single mother. She typed the title and took a deep breath. This wasn't just her own story but would be a message to women in similar circumstances. The days passed busily. She would wake up early, take Jacob to school, work at the bookstore, take shifts at the diner in the evening. Nighttime was for writing. Before falling asleep exhausted, she was determined to write at least 1,000 words. After 3 months, Melissa completed her manuscript. She sent query letters to several publishing houses. While waiting for responses, she continued writing. She believed that even if her first work didn't sell, there would be another chance. The first reply was a cold rejection letter. "Unfortunately, we have determined that there is not sufficient market demand for a single mother's memoir at present." The second and third letters contained similar content. Melissa pasted each rejection letter in her notebook, telling herself, "This is not failure, but a step toward success." "Mom, why are you still up?" One night, Jacob appeared in the living room, rubbing his eyes. Melissa managed a tired smile. "Mom is writing a story. Can't sleep." Jacob sat beside Melissa and leaned against her arm. "I want to read your book someday." "You definitely will be able to," Melissa promised. "That's why I have to keep trying a little longer." On the day the 6th rejection letter arrived, Melissa was nearly giving up. After finishing a double shift at the diner, she dragged herself home to find an unfamiliar envelope in her mailbox. It was from Griffin Publishing. With trembling hands, she opened the envelope. "Dear Miss Watson, we read your manuscript Invisible Mother with great interest. Your frank and moving writing will resonate with many readers. We would like to discuss the possibility of publication." Melissa hugged the letter to her chest and did a small jump in the tiny living room of her apartment. "Jake, listen to this." She gently woke her sleeping son and excitedly told him, "Mom's book might be published." Jacob smiled half asleep and murmured, "I knew it." Jennifer Klein, the editor at Griffin Publishing, saw great potential in Melissa's manuscript. "Your story is raw yet full of hope," Jennifer said in their first meeting. "Could you change the structure a bit and add more voices of single mothers?" Melissa jumped at this suggestion. She began interviewing other single mothers she knew from the diner. Through Lucy, she met even more women and collected their stories. Invisible Mothers grew from one woman's story into a mirror reflecting society as a whole. "Write more," Jennifer said. "Your anger, your sadness, and above all, your strength." Melissa rewrote the manuscript many times. She worked during the day, wrote at night, and sacrificed her limited sleep hours for creation. Jacob noticed the change in his mother. A new light dwelled in her eyes, and her walk showed more confidence. It took nearly a year for the book to be ready for publication. 2 weeks before the book was published, Melissa received a call from Jennifer. "The pre-publication reviews are amazing," Jennifer said excitedly. "Time magazine is going to publish a review. This is big." Melissa couldn't believe it. "Really? Is that normal?" "It's not normal," Jennifer laughed. "Your story is resonating with people's hearts." On the publication day of Invisible Mother, Melissa and her son saw her book displayed in a bookstore for the first time. It was a small local bookstore, but Melissa's book was featured prominently. "Look, Jake," Melissa whispered. "Mom's name is on it." Jacob proudly picked up the book. "Can I take it to school? I want to show everyone." Within weeks, unexpected things began to happen. Melissa's book became a topic on social media, and many single mothers began posting messages of empathy. A famous women's website published an interview with her, which spread even further. "We are not invisible. Society is just looking away." This statement from Melissa resonated with many, and her book sales quickly increased. 2 months later, Invisible Mother appeared on the New York Times bestseller list. "I can't believe it," Melissa cried looking at the list. "Is this real?" A call came from Jennifer. "Get ready. There's talk of a national tour." And she paused for a moment. "Good Morning America wants to feature you." Melissa collapsed into a chair. "Television? Me? Your story is the talk of America right now," Jennifer said. "Are you ready?" The night before the television appearance, Melissa sat Jacob down beside her. "Tomorrow, Mom will be on TV. I'm a little scared, but I think I need to share some important things." Jacob hugged his mother. "You'll be fine, Mom. Didn't I tell you? Your book would definitely sell." The next morning, Melissa Watson's name was introduced on a nationally broadcast morning show. The camera showed her sitting in the studio. The timid woman from before was nowhere to be seen. There sat a confident writer with a straight back. "Ms. Watson, your book is giving courage to many women," said the host. "What do you think is resonating so much?" Melissa took a deep breath and looked into the camera. "We single mothers have always been pushed to the margins of society. We've been told we have no value, that we should be ashamed. But that's not true. Every day, we raise our children with twice the love and strength. I wanted to give voice to those mothers who are there, even if they seem invisible." Her words were clear and powerful. Looking back on her journey to this moment, Melissa herself could hardly believe it. The days of writing in her small apartment, dragging her tired body, the times she received rejection letters but didn't give up, it all led to this moment. When the program ended, her cell phone was flooded with messages. Editors, journalists, and readers offering thanks and support. Among them, there was no particularly eye-catching message. Still nothing from those people. "You were amazing today," Jennifer hugged her. "Bigger things are waiting for you." Melissa returned to the hotel and picked up Jacob from school. Embracing him, she thought that this was just the beginning. Her voice needed to reach more people, and now, she had been given that opportunity. Her smartphone kept ringing. Requests from new media, talks about the next book, proposals for lecture tours. Melissa Watson was no longer an invisible mother. She had become a beacon of hope for many women. That night, after Jacob had fallen asleep in the hotel room, Melissa stood by the window and gazed at the night view. "Can you see?" she whispered softly. "I am here, and I will never disappear again." A week had passed since her appearance on Good Morning America. Melissa's hotel room was overflowing with bouquets, and congratulatory telegrams from the publisher were piled on her desk. Her best-selling book, Invisible Mother, was scheduled for a reprint, and e-book sales were also soaring. "Jake, is everything packed?" Melissa called to her son as she closed her suitcase. "We'll be at our new home by this afternoon." With the income from the book, Melissa was able to purchase a small condominium in New York for the first time. A 2-bedroom unit in a quiet Brooklyn residential area was to become their new base. "Mom, your phone is ringing." Jacob picked up Melissa's smartphone. "Thank you." Melissa took the phone, wondering about the unfamiliar number as she answered. "Hello, this is Melissa Watson." "Melissa." Melissa froze at the voice she heard on the other end. It was her mother's voice, after 6 years. "Mom?" Melissa's voice trembled. "Yes, it's me." Carol's voice sounded softer and older than before. "I saw you on television." "You?" Melissa was at a loss for words. In the corner of the room, Jacob was watching his mother with curious eyes. "You were wonderful," Carol continued. "I read your book too. I was truly moved. Why are you calling?" Melissa regained her composure. "After 6 years of no contact, I want to see you," Carol said. "You and Jacob." Melissa closed her eyes. All the pain of the past, the memory of being thrown out that night, the lonely days that followed came rushing back. "I'll think about it," she answered briefly and hung up. Just before leaving the hotel, the phone rang again. This time it was from her sister Amy. "Mel, listen." Amy spoke calmly, without her previous arrogant tone. "I heard Mom called you. I want to see you too." Melissa laughed coldly. "Why? Because I'm no longer that shameful single mother? Or are you now interested in my success?" "No, that's not it." Amy's voice held urgency. "We were wrong. Especially me. After reading your book, I realized how terrible I was." Melissa couldn't believe Amy's words. "It's been 6 years, Amy. Jacob is 11 now. For more than half his life, you all didn't exist." "I know." Amy's voice grew smaller. "But can't we start over? As a family?" Melissa didn't answer. Jacob took her hand and whispered, "Mom, who is it?" "Your aunt," Melissa answered her son. She was suddenly overwhelmed with sadness. Jacob had a grandmother, an aunt, and cousins, but he barely knew of their existence. "Amy, I can't talk now. Let me think." "Please, Mel," Amy pleaded. "Just meet once, anywhere, even at a cafe. Mom and I both want to see you." Melissa thought about the calls from her mother and sister all day. While Jacob was exploring his room in the new condominium, she stood on the balcony looking down at the streets of New York. "What do you think?" That night, Melissa asked Jacob, "Do you want to meet your grandmother and aunt?" Jacob thought for a moment before answering. "I'd like to meet them. I want to know what kind of people they are." Melissa was touched by her son's pure curiosity. She should think of Jacob's rights rather than her own feelings. He had the right to know his family. 3 days later, Melissa headed to a small cafe in Manhattan to meet Carol and Amy. Holding Jacob's hand tightly, she took a deep breath. "Don't be nervous." Jacob looked up at her. "I'm here with you." Melissa smiled. For 6 years, they had always been each other's support. Entering the cafe, she immediately spotted her mother and sister. Carol looked much older than before. Amy was still dressed in sophisticated clothes, but her face showed signs of fatigue. "Melissa," Carol stood up with tears in her eyes. "And Jacob?" Jacob shyly hid behind her. Melissa placed her hand on his shoulder and said quietly, "This is your grandmother and aunt. Will you sit down?" Amy said with a smile. "Let's order something to drink." They sat at the table, waiting for the waiter to come. In the silence, Carol was staring at Jacob. "He looks just like you, Melissa," she said. "He has the same eyes." "Thank you," Melissa answered briefly. Her body was tense with nervousness. "I read your book," Carol continued. "That day, what we did. I'm truly sorry." Amy nodded as well. "I was the worst sister. Instead of helping when you needed it, I drove you out." Melissa listened to their words in silence. 6 years of suffering wouldn't disappear with simple apologies. "Our actions were unforgivable," Carol continued. "But seeing you succeed, I felt so proud." Melissa felt uncomfortable with those words. "You're proud because I succeeded? If I were still poor, would you be sitting here today?" Carol and Amy looked at each other. Amy spoke up. "Melissa, we were impressed by your strength. How you raised Jacob so well despite any circumstances." "Really?" Melissa's voice was cold. "Who called Jacob a problem child? Who called him my shame?" Jacob sat nervously in his chair. Melissa reminded herself that she needed to control her emotions for her son's sake. "What do you want?" she asked directly. "Why contact me now?" Carol and Amy exchanged glances again. Amy took a deep breath and began to speak. "Things have changed," she said. "Richard was arrested." Melissa was surprised. "What are you saying? Richard was committing investment fraud?" Amy's voice trembled. "He was embezzling clients' money. He's in prison now." Carol continued. "The house, the car, everything was seized. Amy and her children are living in my house now.